No other name in American history symbolizes great wealth and status like the Rockefellers. Now, to their achievements in business and philanthropy, the Rockefeller family is about to add another, the largest auction ever. In May, Christie's and the Rockefeller family will sell off the entire collection of the late David Rockefeller, who passed away last year at the age of 101. The sale is likely to set a new record for an auction of a single collection, estimated at more than $500 million.
Sold at $29 million.
In a rare interview at the family farmhouse in upstate New York, David's son, David Rockefeller Jr., said he hopes the family treasures will find new homes around the world. All the proceeds will go to charity.
Tell us about this collection and why it's so special relative to other collections that people might have seen come up for sale in the past decade or so.
My parents always bought art and fine art with the thought of living with it. It wasn't an investment. It wasn't for a quick turnaround. They didn't have houses that looked like galleries. They looked like homes. And that's really how they thought about it. They wanted to have beautiful things near them where they lived.
And your father said that they never set out to buy things that would appreciate in value for that reason, but they found that when they bought the best quality, it often followed that those things appreciated
It's
the
true.
most.
My father, when he was looking back at all the sectors of his investment, his real estate, his stocks and bonds, his art, he actually had a colleague of his measure how well they had done as generic asset classes, and art won.
Really?
But it wasn't because he started to buy art for an investment. Now, it is true that at a time in his life when he wanted to build up financial assets, he sold off a couple of works, some of the Monet water lilies, for example, and some other pieces that we miss a lot, I have to say. And they took very nice prices in the auctions.
What were his guiding principles when it came to buying things and keeping them?
If it was something valuable and it was going to be in their home, they both needed to like it. So there was a veto system. I suppose if my dad liked something and my mother didn't, he could put it in his bank office, and that was fair game.
The institutions that will benefit from this sale, highlight maybe 3 or 5 of them and why each one was important to your dad, and in what way were they important?
So the Christie's auction, which we hope will be very successful, will benefit 12 different charitable organizations. They were selected by my father during his lifetime and very carefully selected. They included 2 family foundations, the David Rockefeller Fund and the DR Fund, as we call it, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And those are being benefited so that future members of the family can continue to be philanthropists at a generous scale. Then there were 2 universities, the Rockefeller University and Harvard University.
When the public sees that David Rockefeller's estate is selling all of his homes, many of, if not all of the remaining contents of those homes, they ask 2 questions. One, is the family angry about that? And number 2, what's left?
Well, we're sitting in what's left, for one thing. We're sitting at Four Winds, a farmhouse that my mother built with Edward Larrabee Barnes, the architect, and with my father's support. And so this establishment, this set of farmhouses on a hill, will remain, and actually my wife Susan and I are buying it from the estate. The other 3 houses in New York and near Tarrytown and in Maine are being actively sold. They're empty now, and the most valuable things will be sold in the Christie's auction. And there are members of the family who are really sad about that. I'm saddest about the idea of going into an empty house that used to be a beautiful house, full of all these amazing pieces of art and decorative arts. But again, my dad taught me not to look back. So I am so grateful for all of those years in those beautiful places, and very grateful that one of them will still be around.
And it probably helps that they will be going toward great causes.
Oh, yes. No, I mean, I think make very clear this auction is not about bringing wealth to members of the family. It's about doing very important things, bringing additional funds to institutions that my dad really cared about during his lifetime, and most of which he actually played a leadership role in. You know, philanthropy is not just money. It's engagement, it's leadership, it's attention. We were talking the other day about patient capital. Patient philanthropy is very much a hallmark of my father's way in his lifetime. And so every one of the 12 institutions which will benefit from the auction were well known to him, well loved, and about half of them were started by him.
How has the family managed to stay together, so philanthropic, and with such a strong sense of purpose over such a long period of time? What do you think are the secrets to that?
Well, when I'm asked about our family and still being coherent as a family, cohesive as a family, I think there are a number of things that have contributed to that. Among them, very clear statements of values that were passed down, that were even inscribed at Rockefeller Center, my grandfather's credo. So that was very strong, but I always say that if the values weren't lived, the words wouldn't have had impact. So I think the family has tried its best to live those values of to whom much is given, much is expected, for example. So that was values very, very strong. I think another has been homestead, places that were familiar and that were passed down over generations. We live now in a society where most people can't go back to the place they were born, or certainly not their grandparents were born. But I can go back to a place where my great-grandfather lived over 100 years ago and see how he lived and how his son and their grandchildren lived. So this is, I think, a very strong thing. We're lucky in that way. So real estate, values and real estate. Philanthropy has been another big theme. Philanthropy carries the values, but it also has some very specific purposes and causes, some of which are popular at one time and then die out and something else comes in. So some examples of that would be historic preservation. Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg, my grandfather started that, and preservation of beautiful, important places has been a theme of the family. Another has been environmental protection. So those themes have been strong. Values in general, physical properties, and philanthropy have kept us together. Many other families are kept together, at least for a while, by businesses. And the wealth in our family came out, of course, of the oil business of Standard Oil and the various companies that derived from the original Standard Oil Company. But business hasn't kept us together, and there are many families whom it has pulled apart, frankly. Fights over whether you build the business or pay the dividends and all that kind of thing. And so by chance, I think we were lucky that we didn't have a business that was pulling us apart. We had a business that supplied through generation skipping trusts wealth that went down through the generations and dispersed out through more and more people, but still was retained. But we didn't have a core business. And I feel we were very lucky in that way.
The typical conventional wisdom is that it's shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations.
Exactly, yeah.
And you're now on the Rockefeller family 6th or even 7th in terms of young kids. Still a strong family.
We are, and we, meet as a family twice a year, often more than 100 of us in the same room for a Christmas lunch, for example. We have something called the Family Forum. When you're 21, you get invited to those meetings.
One of the things that seems to have kept the family so cohesive and so philanthropic is this sense of frugality. And people are going to have a hard time understanding that. I'm always surprised when I read about the childhoods of various Rockefellers, how frugality and a real appreciation for what things cost is part of it. Talk about that a little bit and how important that is in the value system of the family.
Well, we all heard the story about my great-grandfather's Ledger A and how every item that he bought was inserted so he knew what he had left. And I think that idea of being careful with money was carried down. I mean, we have lived very well. It's not as though we live in tents or something like that, but a respect for spending money wisely and its limitations, and very important.
What was the earliest age in which you were either given an allowance or earning a salary, and at what age were you first giving part of that toward something?
I think it must have been at least by 10 that I was being given an allowance. I think we tended to get it on Sunday morning because we were about to go to church, and whatever we were given, we were about to spend at least a tenth of it in church. But I had classmates who might not have had as much money in their family as we did, but who were spending a whole lot more money than I was. I can remember we were gasping at a friend when I was 13 who took a girl out to dinner and spent $50. We were thinking, oh my God, he must be broke. So I think it's good. I think it's very important that you not get used to going first class when you're a kid. I think to learn, because otherwise you don't learn the value of not having all of that. And I think that was part of the teaching. Our parents could have given us a lot more, and we would have been spoiled, and we would not have learned.
What would you tell those parents? What advice might you give them?
If I was talking to the parents of children who were just learning that their parents were wealthy people, I had actually other people in school telling me that I was a wealthy person. I didn't know it, or that my family were wealthy, because actually I wasn't a wealthy person.
You had people in school telling you
that I was rich, yeah.
And what did you think about that?
Well, first of all, I didn't personally feel rich.
Right.
So that I disagreed with them. I said I wasn't. And then they seemed to know a lot more about the family wealth, because actually And as in many families in those days, sex and money were not subjects that you talked about. So that was funny.
Yeah.
But what would I say if wealthy parents of young children asked me how to bring them up? I think the most important thing is how you behave. What you say is important too, but it's how you behave. How do you treat a waiter or somebody who is serving you in some way? Just so important. And then I think the word gratitude, recognizing that this wasn't something that you created. This is something that came to you because of the luck of the universe.
Were there a couple of sayings or words or phrases that you found your dad repeating to you that you remember?
Well, we used to kid him about one repeated phrase, which is, "This is the best steak I've ever had." This is the best scrambled eggs that I've ever had. And we used to kid him because we would say, "Dad, you always say that." But I think what I came to understand was he was really feeling that, back to the gratitude theme. So that was one thing.
I like that.
He also was a master of understatement. So he would say things like, "I've really had quite an interesting life." Right. God.
When it comes to your family's legacy, which probably even changes over time, what would you say that legacy is now? What would you hope it will be 100 years from now?
I certainly hope it will be about generosity, of which philanthropy is a piece. But people who don't have a lot of money can still be generous, as opposed to selfish or self-oriented. So I hope it will be about those things.
The central premise of your family and what they have done is that to those who much has been given, much is expected, that there is a responsibility with this wealth. Do you think today's wealthy have honored that?
Well, I think many of them have. And in one sense, just going back to raising children, it might be easier for families of wealth to set up philanthropies than it is to help the next generation be all that they can be and be the generous individuals and respectful individuals that they can be. But I think the challenge in multi-generational families is to do both, to make the big gestures that you are able to make philanthropically or in business, and to raise the next generation of human beings to have good values and be respectful, all of that.
Innovation has always been a foundational principle. When you see the philanthropists of today, whether it's Zuckerberg with his LLC, whether it's what Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have done, there's a sense that they have reinvented the entire field through applying business principles to philanthropy, by taking risk with capital to solve social problems, by measuring things, by being involved. Is it really that different from what your family has been doing for over 100 years?
What I do think is different in many of the contemporary large philanthropies is that the same individuals who started and grew and led their businesses want to lead their philanthropies and want themselves to be the solution finders as opposed to financiers of solution finders. So I think that's one theme where if I was smart enough to start Apple or Google or Facebook, I must be smart enough to fix the school system.
Are they right?
There have been some big not rights But on the other hand, as with the Gates Foundation, some amazing transformations in regard to the fight against the scourge of HIV. So there have been some big triumphs and some big mistakes. So what is different? I think with the Rockefeller Foundation, which is the first big philanthropy founded over 100 years ago, my grandfather, who really led it, well, my great-grandfather financed it, but he never sat on the board. Now, that would never happen today with, a Zuckerberg or Gates. They want to be deeply involved, but he trusted his son to take over the foundation leadership, and he trusted his and his son's close advisors to come up with plans for building institutions like a hospital in Beijing, assisting in the early financing of Chicago University, as you say, the Green Revolution. But these came about through the financing of other smart people. So there are those kinds of differences, but I think my family has believed in institution building and in long-term philanthropy, not short-term.
Now, with the collection that's coming up for sale at Christie's, there are hundreds of pieces. Here's one. This was on your father's desk at Chase. For the objects that he kept with him every day, what made them important to him, do you think?
This Syrian incense burner, I think from the 13th century, very old. And there are photographs of it in his office at One Chase Plaza when he was the chairman there. And it came from his mother, so that would be one thing that was important. He loved his mother. She taught him a lot, including certainly about art and beautiful things. It's interesting because it has both an Islamic and a Christian element to it. And I can imagine that in his interest in people from all around the globe, all kinds of people, different religions, skin color, whatever, languages, that he was interested in the differences among people.
He loved diversity.
He loved diversity. He did. And he loved diversity in art. And here in this simple little incense burner, there are Christian images on a piece essentially of Islamic art. So, no, and it made, these things around him gave him joy and made his mind active and his eyes active and really kept him going, I think.
Are there another one or two pieces that are being sold that have special meaning to you or that you think are important to highlight from a personal perspective? Any favorites? The Picasso. Let's talk for a second about Picasso. What do you think of the piece, and is there anything you could tell us about what he ever said about it?
So it's the young girl with flowers. It came from the Gertrude Stein collection. So actually it came into my life after I was young. I didn't grow up with that piece. He loved Picasso in general. He loved the sweep of Picasso's career, and that's a relatively early work. But a favorite of mine, maybe the real favorite of mine personally, is the Matisse Odalisque. It just has, it's sensuous. It has the wonderful color palette of Matisse and the decorative elements that ultimately came into his cutouts, for example. It is more confrontational, whereas the Picasso, you're not really in touch with the eyes, I don't think, of the young girl, but with the Odalisque you are, you know. They loved the Impressionists, my parents did. And it was, but that Matisse, that, you know, I hope whoever buys it, that they invite me to come visit.
Okay, we'll make sure of that. For those who don't have 70 or 80 million for Picasso, there are some items that will be relatively affordable for some people, and they can have something that the Rockefellers had.
Mm-hmm. I think that's wonderful, and I understand that they're starting some of the items as low as $200, and that many people will be able to afford, and I love the idea of thinking about these pieces in many other people's homes. It's like a grand recycling.
I like that. And people buying pieces of this collection are not only getting the object and its provenance, which were probably the best of that category, but they're buying the stories of David Rockefeller and Peggy.
Yeah, that's very nice. I hope that many of the buyers will have that sense that they're buying stories and buying taste and buying something homey as well as something very beautiful.
And there might be some people who say, well, these properties that David lived in and had were beautiful. The family, at least some members of the family, could probably use them. Why didn't he just give them to the family?
Well, our tax laws don't encourage that kind of gifting. And I actually think that's kind of healthy. I was involved with Bill Gates Sr. in advocating for retaining the estate tax. So I do believe in it. And it's true that this auction, or the 12 charities that are going to receive the money from the auctions, they are beneficiaries of the estate tax, because if my parents had been able to give everything to their children, they wouldn't have, but they would have given a lot more, and charities would have gotten less. So, and thanks, estate tax.
And on that point, we came close to losing the estate tax.
I know.
Last year. Not to get into politics, but do you think that, were you happy to see it preserved at a higher level? Do you think philanthropy and charities in the current structure will continue to do well, given what's changed?
The changes in the tax law do create some challenge for charities, but it could have been worse, and I'm very glad that we, preserved the estate tax, and that other taxes did not go lower than they did. I believe in a stimulated economy, that's very good, but I also believe that we need a tax system to do all the things, infrastructure, police, armies, all those. Where do you think they get funded from?
And going back to this collection and the philanthropies that will benefit, I mean, again, the family, David is selling things. In terms of what's left, do they take comfort in knowing that the proceeds of this, even though the things are gone, that the purpose of the family is moving forward because what that money will do?
Yes, I think it's very important for all of us to realize that these places will be owned by others and the art will be owned by others, but we still have the values. We have access to the philanthropic foundations that are family foundations. There are actually 4 of them: the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Rockefeller Family Fund, and the David Rockefeller Fund. And on all of them, there are family board members. It's not our personal charity, they're organized, professionally staffed philanthropies. But they will go on, and 2 of them are being helped by the auction, which is wonderful.
And is it also kind of a grand lesson in how ultimately things are not that important, even for the wealthy, that things
can't take it with you. And yes, I mean, I think that's so important that if you get too attached to material things, it takes your focus off of all of the other important things in life, including relationships. and global peace and all of those other important issues. So it's funny because we're talking about material things that are being sold and how important they are, but at the end of the day, it's not the things themselves that matter in life.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.